Welcome to Boardroom Broadcasts, speaking with listed companies from around the world. You can stay up to date with all our content by visiting www.boardroombroadcasts.com and clicking on subscribe.
Today's guest is Wayne Paterson, President and CEO of ASX-listed Admedus. Wayne has held numerous senior positions in multinational companies and has lived in 7 countries during the past 25 years. Throughout his career, he has been responsible for building and managing multi-billion-dollar businesses throughout the world, including mergers, integrations, acquisitions, and major restructures. Wayne, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jesse.
Firstly, for listeners today, could you explain what Admedus does as a company?
Sure. So Admedus has been around for over a decade. The company traditionally had 3 parts to it. One was the infusion business. It also had a drug development business called immunotherapies. And then in the middle of that, they had a cardiac business that was based around the ADAPT technology. Now, in the last several years, the strategy was to really refine the company back in and focus on the value that would be created by bringing the ADAPT technology further forward into market. And to do that, we had to divest the immunotherapies business, which was taking a lot of cash to develop a drug. And we divested the infusion business. And more recently, we divested some of the portfolio in the ADAPT area to bring the ADAPT technology right into the aortic valve space. So we spent the last couple of years developing an aortic valve project in the TAVR space. And the TAVR space is around about a $5 to $8 billion space globally with a couple of big players. Our company has technology that is, in fact, very well positioned to disrupt that particular market. And so we've had the focus in really bringing that technology forward.
Okay. And so what is the opportunity for potential investors by looking into Admedus?
So I think, there are a lot of small to medium cap healthcare companies, medtech companies, who, have one technology or another and either struggle to commercialize that or in fact struggle to have relevance in the market space. The interesting thing about Admedus, and the reason that I originally joined the board, became chairman, and finally became CEO, was that the ADAPT technology, which is in the middle of this company, was in fact quite unique and does create an unassailable moat around the company. The reason it's unique and that's verifiable is based on clinical data in this space that shows that ADAPT is very different to other products in the area. And the key to that is that in this space, one of the killers of aortic valves and cardiovascular repairs, etc., is a process called calcification, where the material calcifies once it's inside the patient. Admedus has data that goes out to about 10 years that shows that our product does not calcify. It's very well published, and in fact, it's got more data than any other product or company out there, and that's been well recognized by the experts. So the opportunity for investors is really to understand that what we have is actually novel and unique. There is only one ADAPT process. It's clinically relevant and it's very highly published. It also has the support of a lot of clinically relevant people, academics, scientists, and doctors, and therefore is primed to get into the middle of this, this $5 to $8 billion space, due to the novelty and the clinical benefits that this technology brings. So there's a ways to go down the track, but this technology really does have the ability to disrupt a very large market space.
Okay. And you're anticipating your aortic valve technology will disrupt the TAVR market. What does it do and how is it different to what's currently available?
Yeah, so this is really the key to success here. Now, the current valve market, I just talked about the size of that. So we're talking about a valve that is placed inside your heart, aortic valve replacement, via catheter. Now, previously they would crack open your chest, do a surgical procedure, remove an old valve, a stenotic valve, and replace it with a surgical valve. That procedure would take up to 6 hours and could take up to 6 weeks to recover. The TAVR process takes up to about 45 minutes to do the same thing, in that they drive the valve up through your femoral artery, replace the valve, and take the catheter out. You're often out of the hospital in 2 to 3 days. So you can see the difference in that procedure is dramatic. And so that's a space we're focused on. Now, one of the key problems as we move forward. The reason you replace that valve in the first place is because they calcify. It's called aortic stenosis. And calcification is the normal function of age, and it happens if you live long enough, everyone will probably get a stenotic valve. As you replace these valves, you're then back in a position where you've got a new valve in there, the kind of valves that we make and certainly other companies. And over time, that valve will also calcify because it's a foreign material going into the body. Now, that means it degrades and therefore probably has to be replaced at some point down the track. And therein lies the challenge, but also the opportunity for Admedus. That problem has not been addressed. Now, we've come along with a tissue science called DAPT that creates an acellular scaffold and therefore does not calcify in a very different way to other products out there. But calcification is only one part of the equation when we talk about valve durability and valve longevity. The other part of that equation is valve design. Now, all of the other valves out there are made up of three pieces of this material, three pieces of tissue, sewn together, put into a stent or a frame, and then put into the body. Our valve design is single-piece 3D molded, which much more closely mirrors the anatomical correctness of the native aortic valve. Now, what this means is when you combine the tissue science of ADAPT with the anti-calcification properties and the single-piece design of our valve, which again is novel and unique, it's the first and only, and you put these two variables together, tissue science and valve design, you create a more durable valve. And in fact, we've shown that our valve demonstrates up to 40% less wear and tear at the leaflets than the conventional valves. So based on that and based on the current needs of the market that these valves have to last longer now, we think we're right in the middle of what is a perfect storm with the right technology.
You seem to know the product very well. What's your background that's led you to coming in as CEO for this company?
So I've been very fortunate to have been in an industry that I got to learn a lot from for 25 years in the healthcare space. I predominantly worked with two of the largest pharmaceutical companies out there, one being Roche Pharmaceuticals, which I think is number 4 in the industry, and Merck, also another large multinational pharmaceutical company. Now, what this did for me, and my first job was in China. You mentioned the number of countries I've lived in. I started with Roche in China, and I moved around the world, ever increasing responsibilities, country head, region head. And I was also exposed to many therapeutic areas. So I worked across oncology, as Roche is the biggest oncology company in the world. I worked across cardiology, infectious diseases, many, many therapeutic areas where you obviously learn a lot. I had the good fortune to launch about 36 drugs globally into different therapeutic spaces. And the different jobs I held, including one of those jobs where I was global head of cardiovascular medicine, set me up in a way that I obviously had a great exposure to global operations, international commercialization, government policy, regulatory policy across the world. And I think that just gives you a very broad overview. When I joined Admedus, I came in as chairman, and frankly had intended to stay on that role. But as I looked into the company and I could see we had these three disparate parts to the business that needed to be really refined in order for the company to hit its real opportunity, I also could see, coming from a pharmaceutical background, that we had data on the calcification that is now out to 10 years that nobody else had. And I knew in terms of my background that clinical data is the most relevant thing to success when you're in a competitive space. So I jumped on that, and that was the opportunity I saw a couple of years back. And I thought, well, if we've got data right now that nobody else has, then what else have we got? What else can we do? And that's what kind of led us into the TAVR and the valve space, and now puts us beautifully in the middle of what is a very big opportunity.
Okay. With the experience that you have from these large organizations, how are you going to use this to help with Admedus' goals?
Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit there in the last question, but I think, you can't commercialize globally unless you've worked globally in healthcare and commercialize. It's not something you learn overnight. It takes years to do that and to be culturally agile. You've got to understand the government regulators, for sure, the FDA, the European regulators, the healthcare authorities that help you get this done. That's one thing. I think the other thing that it gives you is, when you've been working in those big companies, you're in the C-suite, you're in the big environments, it does teach you how to operate within a large corporate setting. Now, as Admedus, we look to do deals with large corporates in the medtech space. And it's important that you know how to walk the walk and talk the talk with those big corporates if you're trying to get a deal done as a small company. And so I think a lot of that background puts us in a good position for getting deals made, for being able to articulate our opportunities to those big companies, and helping them understand how we will help their business grow globally as well.
So you had also mentioned that while you're an Australian ASX listed company, you're based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So I think it's important to understand in the medical world that both the pharmaceutical industry and the medical device industry tend to cluster their global operations in certain hubs. So for pharmaceutical, for example, it's New Jersey, where you have some of the biggest companies in the world globally headquartered there. And for medical device, it's Minneapolis. Now, it is important to have some operation, some presence in these locations. With regards to medical device, you've got Medtronic globally headquartered here. You've got St. Jude, which is one of the big four globally headquartered here. You've got Boston has one of its biggest campuses here, and Edwards has one of its biggest campuses in the Twin Cities. What that means for us is, one, we have very close proximity and access to those big companies when we want to talk to them. And we do at the global level. And I'm remembering that it's at the global headquarter level where decisions are made on deals and so on. So you do need to be there. Otherwise, you'd be trying to fly in. And it does help when you're local. But secondly, and probably more importantly, because of the clustering of those organizations, you have a lot of talent that you have access. Now, Admedus is in a development phase. We're developing high-grade medical products, valves, catheters, and so on. And you need medical engineers. Now, Minneapolis is literally full of dozens and dozens and dozens of medical engineers. And in fact, we employ some of those people to help drive our TAVR project forward. They're very quick. There's more of them per square inch than anywhere else on the planet, I believe, here. And that helps us drive our projects forward, probably at the lowest possible cost that we can get away with, because we have so much of that talent sitting right here on our doorstep.
Interesting. Okay. And for yourself, are there any unique lessons that you've learned across this extensive business career related to either the pharma industry or being in a position of leadership?
My gosh, there is literally dozens of lessons I learned along the way, that's for sure. You can imagine I started my first assignment in China for Roche, taking over an organization of folks that generally didn't speak a lot of English, and I clearly didn't speak a lot of Chinese, right up to running whole regions and becoming president of Europe for Merck and global head of cardiovascular medicine. And each one of those jobs had brought something along with it. But what I learned generally, as a rule of thumb, is that cultural agility is critically important. When you're looking from a leadership perspective, I was president of Japan at one stage, where the culture clearly is very different to ours. You've got to be able to rally people to a common cause, a common goal, a common objective, whatever that corporate objective is. You've got to be able to do that in a way that makes sense to them. One thing you can't do, and where I've seen certainly expat managers fail, is judge the local cultures for what something different. You've got to be able to take the corporate objectives and package them in a way that the local organizations understand them and still achieve a goal that's acceptable for all parties. And so what I really learned to do is how to communicate cross-culturally an objective, rally an organization around that objective, and then make sure it was executed.
Okay. Now, if we go back to how you've taken that experience for Admedus, what's the outlook for the company?
So, I mean, the company, when I was in the chairman role and took over, there was a long history to this company, and you'll see that reflected in the share price. It had certainly a choppy history, as you often see with these small cap companies on the ASX. I think the clarifying moment for me was when I decided to go from chairman into the CEO role with one clear objective. And the first objective was to just clear out the peripheral businesses and divest those to make sure the company could focus the capital that was being raised through cap raises from shareholders. I think was being not necessarily used efficiently across three different divisions and so on. And so that objective was to rally the organization into a single point of focus, which is the ADAPT technology, go into the TAVR space, clear out the peripheral businesses, and make sure the capital being brought in was being used efficiently to drive that forward. Now, that does take some time. It took a couple of years. But what we've achieved over that time now is we're sitting in an organization. We have developed this TAVR project. We have the acclaim of a lot of very important academics. We've got a medical advisory board of TAVR doctors from the biggest centers in the US who meet with us regularly. They're out there advocating for us as well. And we're appearing at some of the most important international cardiac congresses. So that ability to focus and bring the organization forward and even though we spend capital, we're still running on very limited capital to achieve these tasks, which means people have to work longer and more efficiently. So they really have to believe in that mission. And so all of that history of how to drive an organization forward and rally people around a common cause, I think has helped a lot with getting Admedus to where it is today.
Excellent. So before we finish today, is there anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to understand the nature of, I think, companies in general, the small cap companies on the ASX, of which, Admedus was part of that group, and remains part of that group. You see the two kinds of companies roll through here. Companies like Admedus was in the past, where you maybe have a lot of different focuses and trying to get a lot done. Frankly, Admedus didn't have a great sense of self. And then there's companies who have general, really viable technologies that have come from Australia, like Adapters that was developed down there, that have really global potential. And I think, it's important to understand that Admedus was one of those companies that was kind of swimming around in circles with a technology that is actually unique, novel, and clinically relevant. And now we've been able to lift that out and capitalize that and maximize those opportunities in the global space.
Excellent. Well, Wayne, thanks very much for your time today.
Good stuff. Thanks, Jesse. Appreciate it.
This has been a production of BoardroomBroadcasts.com, a division of Romulus Rising Proprietary Limited. All rights reserved. You can stay up to date with all our content by visiting www.boardroombroadcasts.com and clicking on subscribe.